Greetings. Welcome to this chat about inclusive education. These sessions are intended to introduce to you people that are making a difference across Canada in developing inclusive schools. And I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada. My co-hosts today are Diane Richler, who's the chair of the Catalyst for Inclusive Education, a project of Inclusion International. Diane's also a former executive vice president of what's now Inclusion Canada. And Jackie Specht, who's the director of the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education, located at Western University in London, Ontario. And Jackie's a professor of education at Western and works with a group of academics across Canada on inclusive education research and program development. So our guest today is Ken Pike. Ken's from St. John, New Brunswick. He's not an educator per se, although he probably knows a lot more about education than many people who call that their profession. He's a lawyer. And Ken has worked in law. He's also worked for quite a few years as the Director of Social Policy and Government Relations with the Brunswick Association for Community Living. He's done outstanding work, is highly regarded both in New Brunswick and in other parts of Canada, and he's been recognized in New Brunswick. A few years ago, he received the Human Rights Award from the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission. And just recently, he was named a member of the Order of New Brunswick, which is the province's highest honor for its citizens. So welcome, Ken. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we look forward to chatting with you.
Great to be here. Thank you.
So can we start perhaps with asking how a lawyer working in a law firm in St. John, New Brunswick ends up 30 some years later working on things like inclusive education and employment for people with disabilities and a whole raft of things involved with social issues. Not, well, maybe, do they involve specifically law? Tell us about that.
Well, the beginning time was I just had been admitted to the bar here in New Brunswick, and of course I was very much a junior lawyer in a firm in St. John, and we had at that time, there was quite a group of families and parents that were part of the leading the charge around inclusive education, and there had been, unbeknownst to me, a lot of discussions going on around this idea of their sons and daughters being able to attend regular classrooms. And when the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms came in 1982, and then following the Section 15 of the Charter coming in force in 1985, these families saw a real tool to advance their goals of having their children in the regular education system. And back in those days, of course, there was a high degree of segregating education programming, separate schools, classrooms, all under a whole different legal framework. So the senior partner of the firm had this group of families, and with the support of the St. John ACL local, drop into his office. He had some involvement with the local association prior to this, and they wanted to challenge the school's legislation at the time. And he ended up tossing the file on my desk and said, "Go run with this and see what you can do with it." So that was the beginning of the journey. Although I had an older brother, 10 years older, brother with Down syndrome. To that point, I had never heard of the association. And my parents, having 7 children, were a little busy and didn't have time for that kind of involvement. And so that was my introduction to the world of the association and our, the goals for an inclusive life for people with an intellectual or developmental disability.
Do you see the work of the law itself as having contributed to inclusion in New Brunswick schools in significant ways, or not?
Yes, partly, and I think it was the change in our education legislation in 1986 that set the expectation, and certainly founded on equality rights in the charter. Because of that then forced the system to do a whole bunch of different things, and also, of course, led to the repeal of legislation that provided for that segregated schooling experience. So all of a sudden, the education of children with an intellectual disability was part of regular education legislation at the time. So so it did, and of course, being a small province, things are able to happen more quickly, but it forced the system to do something radically different, because the law now said something very, very different, in that children who were, in the language of the time, considered exceptional had to be educated in regular classroom environments with some provisos on that. So it forced the system to do a kind of an about face, and I know that there were early day struggles with that, but it really had a meaningful impact.
So Ken, what prompted the change in legislation, and was there a strong role of families and of the Association for Community Living in that process?
Yeah, I think families, and certainly our provincial association with some of the locals, that I mean, there had been a lot of discussions going on with government, provincial government at the time, through the provincial association. The small role that we had was a charter of rights case, trying to declare the then education legislation unconstitutional based on Section 15, and in terms of denial of equality rights for children with an intellectual disability.
And what was the result of the case?
Well, the pleadings were filed, of course, had to give government notice that they were being that there was a legal action coming. I think it just helped speed up the conversation quite a bit around, okay, what are we going to do about this? And it ended up putting pressure on government to act more quickly. I think it would have happened sooner or later, but this case, and at the time we had the premier of the province was one of the leaders around the Charter of Rights, so that helped our arguments, and when there were meetings with the premier and saying this is a human rights issue, shouldn't be segregating children based on disability, he fundamentally agreed with that. And I think the legal action piece just lit a fire under government. And there were allies in the Department of Education that supported this effort as well. But I think it just made things a little go a little quicker. And it was interesting. So that the end result was Bill 85, which repealed legislation that sort of authorized the segregated school environments, and built in the provision that children with exceptionalities were required to be educated in the regular classroom. So that was sort of the end result, and then over the ensuing years trying to figure out how to do that really well and make that a province-wide initiative. But that took a long time as well.
I'm wondering then, like, why don't we see that happening in other provinces in Canada when we all have the same charter?
That's a good question. I mean, there have been limited court cases, and I think the Supreme Court of Canada case in Eaton, and I can't remember the year. I think it was the early 90s. It put a real chill on the idea of using the charter as a tool, because that case went in the opposite direction. There were some comments by the court around the right to be included, but ultimately decided that the position of the school authorities was where they landed. So so I think that the Eaton case really put a real chill on using the legal tools here in Canada. And of course, subsequently, the Moore decision, which was more recent, but unlike some other maybe some other jurisdictions, that the courts weren't seen as the sort of the friendly place to try and overhaul the education system based on Charter of Rights.
And talk a little bit more about the role that family-based organizations have played in the evolution of inclusive education in New Brunswick, because those beginning days of the court case was one thing, but there have been other supports. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's been at a couple of levels, at least, or more. One is certainly trying to better inform families around what quality inclusive education looks like. So, even today, but over the years, there were struggles with efforts being made by schools. The children may have been in classrooms, but not really included. So there was a whole education piece with families about what should it look like, and what we were certainly aware of inclusive education being done badly. It was the student at the back of the classroom with an assistant, but not really fully included in the learning. So so we had to do work at that level and bring in and use our own experts like Gordon and Julie Stone and others around helping families understand what should this look like. And I think the other part is, for our association for community living here, as a provincial advocacy organization, really being involved in the systemic reform and systemic change discussions with government and Department of Education, in particular around, so what's it going to require now, and even back starting in the late 1990s, when the national organization began community inclusion funding, we were looking at how we could use that funding to support some learning within the system itself. So we actually over time used a lot of our community inclusion money to help build system capacity, and looking at how we could provide better training opportunities for educators and other school principals and people in the system. At the same time, that we understood, I think, that the legislation wasn't enough, and so when it was kind of an aha moment where one meeting many years ago, we're sitting around a table with some government officials, and the director of what was called Student Services at the time, Bob Gerard, had said, well, one of the biggest problems that we have is we have legislation, but we don't have policy. to help interpret that legislation and set the standards. And so that was kind of a real moment of understanding for us that, you know, having legislation wasn't going to be enough from a legal point of view. We as a family organization needed to be pushing for further change as well. So we've invested a lot in sort of that systemic advocacy, working in collaboration with government departments, working on their committees, and, you know, being front and center around trying to move the needle, and understanding that, you know, moving from law to policy to practice there was a lot of work involved. And so between that building of that family understanding and some leadership around that, as well as working at the systems level, and having some allies within government and Department of Education was certainly key in helping us push things forward. But you know, even today, that's still fragile as we're learning.
But I live in a large province where, I mean, that kind of relationship between the family-based organization and ministry officials, I don't think most people could even imagine. So how did it evolve from where you were adversaries ready to take the government to court to a point where you were invited in, or at least accepted in, to really be partners in developing that policy? What can other provinces learn from that process?
Well, I think a lot of it had to do with our, you know, I mean, our doggedness and determination, but that combined with having some key allies in the system, and building those relationships. And, you know, every time there was a change in the Minister of Education, we were, you know, one of the first organizations to be knocking on the door to have the conversation about how we can improve our inclusive education system. So I think being a smaller jurisdiction certainly had a lot of benefits, because the bureaucracies were smaller, and wasn't unusual that you would know a minister. Somebody had a relationship with a minister or a deputy or somebody else in education ministries or a district superintendent. So I think part of it is just being able to build on those relationships with key people in the system, and continue to have the conversations about what needed to change, and what was required to even keep moving the needle, because we understood that it was not all perfect across the province. And I think when Gordon and Angela did their tour in 2011-ish, it was maybe 2010, that, you know, a lot of things were discovered that, you know, we were far off the mark around inclusive practice. So I think, yeah, and I just, you know, we've had conversations with people from other jurisdictions. A family group from Australia was here 2 or 3 years ago, and they were asking some of the same questions. And I think whether part of it's you know, just keeping the focus on the goal, but I firmly believe that having those relationships with key people, and, you know, being able to be invited into conversations with government was extremely beneficial for our progress here.
Ken, what's the relationship of your organization and your advocacy efforts with the teachers of New Brunswick? Maybe both on an informal basis, but also in terms of their association and their teachers union? What's been the kind of collaboration? What kind of stresses, if there have been any, have been there?
I think from it's on a sort of school district or even individual school level, we've been able to build some good relationships. When we were using some funds to do training with educators, it allowed us to have conversations both with educators, principals, build understanding and build on the work of our educational leaders, really, and people like yourself, Gordon, and others that were keen to see a lot of this happen better throughout the province. So those, again, being tied into what was going on in some local districts and having foot in the door, really, with training and education opportunities really helped. In terms of the teachers federations, I think those relationships have evolved over time, and I think that over the last few years we've been probably stronger than they've had in the early days. But I think the ability to have conversations to understand what their concerns were. Of course, the thing that kept on coming up in those conversations is, often we would hear, well, it's not really the students that you're concerned with. It's those kids with behavior issues that are the real pressure point in our system. And so being able to understand what the sort of realities of the people in the education system were, where we could perhaps support some of that through our advocacy work better. Certainly one of the areas that seemed to be a common theme for us was better access to education and training for principals and educators. So pushing that as a potential solution to some of the challenges that they were facing, and looking at some of their resource issues and struggles. And one of the things that has been, I think, a bit of an issue is our reliance on educational assistance here in our system, and there's been some data that shows that we have a high proportion of educational assistance, and looking at how educators can be better supported was also very critical in the work that was done around looking at the key roles of resource teachers and how we support them to do better support with educators in their schools. So yeah, so I think it's not always been a easy relationship, but I think it's one that's still evolving, and certainly one that we have to pay a lot of attention to.
So Ken, it's now 35 years since Bill 85 was passed in 1986. That's 35.
That's 35.
So there's practically no one in the public education system in New Brunswick that was working when this all started. So looking at it from that perspective, what do you see as the overall attitude or sense of change and progress by people who are teachers, or even parents for that matter? I guess you could argue that both parents of school-age children and teachers of school-age children have lived in a province where more or less inclusion has been the fact of the day. What do you see that as bringing to the conversation today?
Well, it's, I think, really interesting when I talk to some younger parents how much they just take this as a given, right? And that their child is going to be included in their neighborhood school, in the classroom with the other children in the neighborhood. So it's I think at that level, after 35 years, that's kind of more than now the expectation rather than the exception. And we're also seeing that with educators. Each year, as you know, we do the National Inclusive Education Awards. So that allows us to sort of peek behind the curtain a little bit about some of the things that are going on in schools and classrooms, and seeing how educators are trying to be innovative, trying to be inclusive. Broadly see that mindset of, well, these kids belong in our schools and classrooms. It's certainly not all perfect. There are pressure points that still exist. How we support children who have behaviors that challenge is probably the leading one still, and there's growing challenges around students, children and students who have mental health concerns. So those are the things that, looking forward, we're going to have to try and really help the system figure out. There's always the risk that we're going to slide back to more segregated learning, and that threat is real and present. So I can't rest on the laurels. I think we've made significant progress throughout the province, but there are pressures wanting to go in the other direction.
Progress, but vigilance needed.
Yes, very much.
Diane.
Ken, I note that your current title is Director of Social Policy. And if my memory serves me, I think that the closure of the Children's Institution in New Brunswick was another reason for, or gave more impetus to, inclusive education, because suddenly there were these children who were going to be coming into the school system, and the existing special education didn't have the capacity to serve them. So it opened up some questions. But I'm wondering, in the ensuing years and even now, what are some of the other issues that have to be resolved in communities for inclusive education to be supported? I think about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the recognition, even in the general comment on the article about inclusive education that was prepared by the responsible UN committee, a recognition that many other articles of the convention have to be respected for inclusive education to succeed.
Yeah.
What's the story in New Brunswick? What do you think are some of your other major social pillars that make inclusion successful?
I think certainly the belief, and one of the interesting alignments that's happened later was how we figure out inclusion in the early years, in the early learning and childcare, and we're still on that journey and still looking for good policy around that. But it have been large advancements in that area. So that experience of children being in regular early learning environments, and how they make that transition to school is key. I think just in general, having recognition of the contributions that people with an intellectual or developmental or other disability can make to our communities. The spillover in terms of reform, in terms of disability supports. We're in the middle of a transformation of our day programs to shift to employment, and how we can better support people in communities, especially in the context of of limited finances. It's in all interesting discussions, but I'm not sure if those gains are made unless we have the foundation of an inclusive education system. And for us, being able to point to our education system over the years and saying, look, we're including people in this environment, why not the rest of society? So that's been, I think, a huge bonus for us in terms of advocating for broader systems change and better policies that support the right of people with a disability be fully included in their communities.
That's going to be the last word. Our time's up.
All right.
Ken, thank you so much for joining us. It's obvious your commitment is not only over many years, but it's very deep. And we know you've made a real difference in your province and beyond. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to collaborating with you further in the future.
Thank you very much. Glad to have the opportunity.